Hi, this is a continuation of the talk that I had prepared and was going to give in on Zoom, but we didn't have enough members, so we ended up canceling it. I'm going to share this with people who are interested and also upload it on YouTube. Okay, we talked about the early days of starvation diet, followed by the groundbreaking discovery of insulin, followed by the need to prevent complications from diabetes, which were occurring, or so-called micro and macrovascular diseases such as heart disease, blindness, kidney failure, hypertension. And for that, the treatment ended up being increasing the carbohydrate. And perhaps this was controlled by the rise of internal combustion engine and science of heat and thermodynamics because we thought that it was relatively straightforward, calories in, calories out. And calories became very popular in the early 20th centuries and were popularized for diet restriction. And we thought we had the problem licked. But the biology is very complicated, and a body has learned to evolve complex mechanisms and intracellular communications to maintain what was classically defined as homeostasis or balance of pre-existing state, because nature does not like too many changes, and there's a matter of survival. So for the times when food was not available, the body likes to conserve fat, and that's the default mechanism. Now, after the Second World War, and with the prevalence of cigarette smoking, heart disease increased dramatically. And based on observation studies that were done with so-called seven-country studies and also in Framingham studies, people tended to see the observation that high cholesterol was related to uh, heart disease. But perhaps, even there we were jumping the gun that we assume that correlation is causation. And again, the fat metabolism was intricately complicated with liver, pancreas, insulin, and all the three fruit groups. And again, brain uses a tremendous amount of sugar for, even though it's relatively small bodies, a portion of the body's body mass, it uses a lot of sugar. And when sugar is not available, it uses glycogen. And when that is not available, it uses something called ketones. So all these discoveries are followed in the 30s to 50s. And so, in and at the same time, even from the Darwinian age, Darwin era rather, we were fascinated by what is normal, and we came up with the concept of body metabolic mass index, which it turns out again was rather oversimplification. And I showed some other slides last time, which showed that a sumo wrestler is not the same as a gymnast, and they can both be healthy or unhealthy. So, and again, so we went back on from the drastic restriction of cholesterol to realizing that, well, maybe cholesterol wasn't so bad after all. So this, I showed the two covers of Time magazine, and again the lipoprotein metabolism was dependent upon genetics, the types of fat, and ethnicity. And again, we discussed the various ethnic regions had different complication rates in spite of having high rice intake. And then again, to how to judge the efficacy of diabetes management, that gradually morphed from simple urine testing to blood testing to test strips to a parameter that was proposed fairly recently, actually in 1968, but it took a long time for it to become main accepted by the mainstream. So a glycolated hemoglobin means a sugar attached to the protein moiety, and hemoglobin is a protein after all. So, and that gives us a retrospective window because the blood cells are recycled every 120 days. So you can see how much sugar was attached to the hemoglobin protein. And so that's one way to look at it. And so these are some of the measurements. Again, there were some outliers, who were involved in more blood sugar management, and based on titrating the blood sugar precisely, he realized that he was able to stay alive. And then with the increasing incidence of heart disease, the cardiometabolic kidney-metabolic syndrome was suggested by the American Heart Association, as you saw from the logo of the Heart Association. And let's go through this complicated slide if I can. Okay, and I will see my pointer that the role of inflammation became much more central, and the thinking changed from just thinking cholesterol sticking to the blood vessels, saying that the mechanism of inflammation and reaction to oxidative stress, along with insulin resistance, blood vessels dysfunction, became known as playing a major role in causing heart attack and kidney disease. So, and then again, we learned about the different types of fat, and the so-called brown fat versus white fat, fat that is under the skin versus fat that's around the viscera, primarily liver and pancreas and other or kidneys. So that and heart, of course. And we learned about the role of neurohormonal activation, okay, as to varieties of hormones and potentially toxic in lipid moieties playing a role. So we are finally learning the complex dance that was going on in the body, uh, unknown to us, with how interconnectedness of brain, immunity, inflammation all became apparent as time went by. Maybe already talked about him, sorry. So again, this is, and at the same time, we are creatures of habit, and our behavior is influenced by our socioeconomic conditions, our parenting, availability of type of food. So that had a huge impact, because if, for example, the so-called healthy foods such as fruits and vegetables are not available, while on the other hand, fast food there is McDonald's on every corner and Starbucks on every other corner, it just becomes easily available. So it's a very quick way to pack up a lot of calories on the run, so to speak. And it takes a long time to burn up calories, because even if you work out till you are blue in your face, at the most you might, for like say 30-40 minutes of jogging, may burn about 300 or 400 calories depending upon your weight. But you can easily consume by stopping at McDonald's and treating yourself to a Big Mac and a milkshake, which can easily give you 1,200 calories in a matter of 10 to 15 minutes that it may take you to consume. Okay, now the big thing that is insulin resistance, and I would like to overemphasize the importance of insulin resistance. And because it's such an important factor in the large percentage of diabetes, which is type 2. There are so-called rare monogenic diabetes, which are of curiosity, and we'll address that just for completeness of sake. But the bread and butter diabetes is insulin resistance. Now, there is an English website called Future Learn, which is free with registration, and just by sheer coincidence, they had a class on reversing diabetes type 2 by diet counseling, dietitians with the long arm of NHS, and that was a very low-key place course. So, and obviously they had some real biochemical science. So I just was able to download one of their videos, and I will play this for you because repetition is very useful.
So this is a guy called Ronald Kahn who's looking very pleased with his work. The reason I wanted to show you that is because we can also play about with this system a little bit experimentally. We could also have an intravenous glucose load, which we do in some of our tests, whether that be I
think it's not playing for some reason. Let's see, why is it not playing? Okay, let's see if I should change my...
early research tests where we can infuse milligrams per deciliter, which they tend to in the States. This is the part.
No, I can... Okay, let me just stop share and see if I can... No, I can't get it to play, so let me just continue with my own talk. Okay, I think I should be able to play this now. Let's see it.
A guy called Ronald Kahn who's looking very pleased with his work. He has defined insulin resistance as where normal concentrations of insulin produce a less than normal biological response. So suppresses lipolysis or fatty acid release into the circulation, stimulates lipoprotein lipase to enhance lipid storage. It also suppresses some of the cholesterol production and the export of lipids from the liver. We've talked about these. Suppresses endogenous glucose production from the liver, stimulates glucose uptake into the muscle and the adipose tissue, inhibits protein breakdown, so stops us breaking that down, and stimulates protein synthesis, amongst other things. We've already talked about this, but just showing it in a schematic format. You've got an oral glucose absorption coming from the GI tract. We're going to get some beta cell secretion because that's going to be stimulated when the blood sugar goes up. That's going to be slightly delayed. We've got insulin action, which is going to increase our glucose clearance, reduce our glucose production. So this liver glucose production, which has been keeping us going in between meals, stops, and this glucose utilization goes up. Now the reason I wanted to show you that is because we can also play about with this system a little bit experimentally. We could also have an intravenous glucose load, which we do in some of our tests, whether that be primarily research tests where we can infuse into the systemic circulation an intravenous glucose load that bypasses all of the effects going on in the gut, or we can get...
just to make a point that the response to oral and intravenous are different, and you will see that there is some unusual outcome that you see. It's to do with our so-called new diet drug, incretin inhibitor drugs. So that an interesting thing, and I'll have some slides for it later on.
People to drink a sugary drink in oral glucose tolerance tests, we can do those. How do we measure insulin resistance. So HOMA IR there's a few different HOMA indices that you can look at. HOMA IR is a homeostatic model assessment of insulin resistance. And it's a nice simple calculation. We multiply plasma glucose by plasma insulin, and then we divide it by something. This number, there's two different numbers depending what glucose is measured in units. Over in the EU, we like to go with millimoles per litre, so we divide it by 22.5. There's a different number if you measure glucose in milligrams per decilitre, which they tend to in the States. This is the pathway of how glucose gets taken up in the muscle, so you may remember it from various talks that you've had along the way. You've got some insulin, binds to a receptor here, stimulates a load of proteins that stimulate these little GLUT4 transporters to go up into the muscle. Okay, and these are the bridges that allow glucose to pass into the cell. Now, when someone becomes insulin resistant, it could either be because there's an issue with the receptor, so the process never even gets started, or we could have what we call a post-receptor defect, which is where something goes on further down the chain. So insulin might be stimulating the receptor just fine, but it breaks down along the way and the process has become less efficient. Again, in reality, it's far more complicated than this, and people are probably going to have both. So the sort of things that are affecting those molecules could be things like free fatty acids, circulating inflammatory markers, various other things. I'm trying to think of some more. Oxidative stress is another one that people talk about nowadays. And yeah, that is what then you're going to get various chemicals here and products which start interfering with what's going on. Just to give a little overview, there's a general theme underlying insulin resistance called lipotoxicity. We've got lean adipose tissue here, we have overnutrition, we get obese adipose tissue here. Various things happen here, including the tissue becoming hypoxic, so it can't be provided with all the oxygen and the various bits that it needs. You get a stress response, you get an inflammatory response, and you get systemic inflammation in the blood. Now, what I wanted to overlay over the top of this is a bit more information about free fatty acids. We get loads of fatty acids from the adipose tissue circulating in the blood. We also get some triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, which come from the gut having had a meal. Where do these need to go? Well, they go through this pathway, and eventually we convert them into triacylglycerol or triglyceride. The name is interchangeable. And then depending where, liver, skeletal muscle and adipose tissue, a lot of this goes in all three. These are either going to be oxidized and burnt as fuel, they can be stored in lipid droplets, or if it's in the liver, they can be repackaged and recirculated, and just try and keep things under control as much as we can. We've got increased free fatty acids. We've got loads of them. We're going to store these lipid intermediates, which aren't very good. They're going to make us more insulin resistant in a number of different tissues, including adipose. Your adipose tissue is going to become insulin resistant. You're not going to get as much suppression of lipolysis as you might want, and that's going to further increase the free fatty acids. So it's very much this cyclical nature where somebody might be a bit insulin resistant, they might be obese, not everybody starts from the same point. So if we talk a little bit about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in a bit more detail, because it's quite a good example of a comorbidity that is contributed from obesity, insulin resistance, elevated lipids, lots of that. NAFLD, or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which I'm going to shorten to NAFLD, is a whole spectrum of conditions actually, but they're all characterised by the accumulation of fat or intrahepatic triglyceride in the liver, which we call hepatic steatosis. It's diagnosed really when liver fat, or IHTG, is greater than about 5%, depending what technique we use to measure it. And importantly, it's independent of excessive alcohol intake. That doesn't mean that someone with a fatty liver can be getting a fatty liver because they have a bit of lifestyle related NAFLD and also are a heavy drinker as well. So because somebody might have NAFLD doesn't mean that they can't have alcoholic liver disease as well, or vice versa. Now that isn't the end of the world from a hepatology point of view. It's not ideal, but the liver can store some fats for a decent amount of time without too many consequences. People develop inflammation alongside that. This is where the hepatologists start to get a little bit worried if they think someone has a condition called NASH, because that's when you're going to increase your chances in 15 to 25% of people of advancing to cirrhosis, which might involve in liver transplant or death, and actually 7% of these guys with cirrhosis can also develop hepatocellular carcinoma. So this is kind of the step where the hepatologists start.
Sorry, it's a rather long video, but I think it is interesting. And no.
And about 17% of it. It was only once you started getting big, 8 to 10-year-olds, come with disease, hypertension, dyslipidemia, and chronic kidney disease. So how do we get people who have hepatic steatosis? How does it happen? Well, it's a very simple relationship, a little bit like the energy balance relationship that James spoke to you earlier on, in that liver fat, or IHTG, is regulated by the amount of lipids supplied to the liver and how good it is at doing something with it. They're going to have high circulating lipids, they're going to have high circulating glucose, okay, after each meal. They're also physically inactive. Utilization. So actually, our VLDL export goes up and our fat oxidation goes up because it doesn't want to store this if it doesn't have to, so it gives it a good shot. Now, unfortunately, it can't do it enough, so we get hepatic steatosis because it has to store the rest. So what, if we bring it back to diabetes, which is why we're here ultimately, what's going to happen if we decrease glucose uptake?
Okay, so I think it's a rather long video, and they're talking about mostly prevention with the National Health Service Program. So, okay, so we've already repeated some of these, and we went over this. I think we have beaten this one to death. And sometimes some of the medications that we prescribe have a role also, because if you are requiring a lot of cortisone for rheumatoid arthritis, if you are on HIV drugs, which are the so-called protease inhibitors, some of the SSRIs, like a Prozac and serotonin inhibitors, have a lot to do with this. Some of the psychiatric drugs have a relationship, again. So this is, so sometimes the physicians alone, may be contributing it directly or indirectly. So we already talked about, but just simple aging alone is a big factor. And so this is a very complex physiological dance that goes through. Okay, and now, so this, and there were some interesting studies done for intensive blood sugar control studies that were done in the 90s, and again, people were, their insulin requirement went up and up, and their weight went up, so this was, the more insulin you gave, people became more obese. So this was, and so this is ultimately the brain, and the hypothalamus has a huge role in it. And I have some slides later on going about it. So, so this was, so nature giveth one way and taketh away another way type of thing. So, okay, and this again more, we went over some of this, and okay, all right, and that's, you thought the other one was not complicated. This is even equally more complicated, but I think it's we can see it's a very similar slide to what we talked about earlier, and I've gone over some of the things earlier, but it's nice to go over that, and we emphasize the importance of different recognizing and giving allowance, and thermodynamics was not, our answer. So again, when the American Heart Association tried to emphasize the reduction of fat, the diet industry caught on to it and started putting labels on food as to low in fat, low in cholesterol. And then again, so that did not solve our problems. So, and with it, lightly sweet keto diet. So there are tons of advertisement campaigns that took place, and ultimate outcome was that we become more and more fat as a nation. And not only that, this is directly related to poverty and lack of resources. And so we talked about, and this phenomenon is exploding even in children, that even children are developing type 2 diabetes, which was uncommon. Okay, so this is in the so-called developing world. It's the problem is even worse because the population is larger and the numbers are staggering as we go along. And these are some of the old ads that we have. I mean, they are almost makes you cringe nowadays. Kids need energy that candy gives. And I don't know, I'm not even sure if this is real or not, but I just can't believe it that, giving kids 7 Up, so, but that was Madison Avenue at their best. Okay. And so again, this enlarges the complications in a lot more details than you'd care to know, starting from brain onwards to, uh, coronary artery disease to varieties of arthritis. And this is the Nature magazine from time to time puts out reviews or disease primers. And so this is one of their slides. You can just see the childhood obesity comorbidities that can occur. And the same thing occurs in adult, starting from your stomach to arthritis to sleep disorders, and even some skin changes that take place in diabetes. Okay, all right, and so a lot of times, I'm sure some of you have read the books by Michael Pollan on diet. It said, eat more plant-based diet and the other products, dairy products, in small quantities. And and again, a lot of genes are intricately related in all this. We talked about the role of fructose and how intricately brain is connected as the brain produces certain hormones that the gut produces that affects on our brain and gives us the feeling of full. And these are the two leptin, which makes us is related, and so is another hormone called ghrelin, which is so brain has sensing pathways which have a leptin, so-called leptin melanocortin pathway that has been playing some huge role in, and so even in psychiatry journals one can find some of these research papers related to the role of a brain in behavior changes. And there are some other lesser known peptide hormones which are called amylin, cholecystokinin, and have again a role in making us feel full. Okay, and again the disruption of the melanocortin. So even just a lack of sleep has a lot to do with it. You can just see the adipose tissue. It stimulates leptin. The leptin goes down to the varieties of neurons in the brain, and that has a lot to do with the amount of food that we consume. So these are the various nuclei in the brain, which I mean the abbreviation is of not important for this talk, but that signals to these neurons and influences our food intake in causing severe obesity. So this is, so leptin has a role not just on animal studies, but also in humans. So I'll have some, and ghrelin is another hormone that is secreted when the ghrelin is absent in animals. It has improved insulin sensitivity, basically, and so these are the varieties of so-called hunger hormones, and that are secreted. So, and there are a variety of receptors in our brain are directly related to how much when you consider yourself as feeling full. Okay. So this is the role of ghrelin. You can see here that ghrelin is stimulated, and it affects directly on the pancreas and is related to, goes on the brain. It gets on your hypothalamus, where you have the nuclei in the brain, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and affects directly the stomach, intestine, and has direct relationship onto the controls our energy balance and so-called glucose homeostasis. Okay, it occurs through varieties of other growth hormone receptors in the brain, and when the and pharmacological treatment of especially on animal research shows to sustain become more fat, they start eating more and their metabolism changes dramatically. So again, and we talked about the ghrelin deficient of animals. Okay, so it's a classic combination of varieties of receptors and hormones as to they play the intricate role in controlling the metabolic. And then now kids who have leptin deficiency, okay, you can see how dramatically they have normal birth rate and start eating hyperphagia with no preference. And I mean, their parents would have to almost lock their refrigerator at night because otherwise they will eat frozen food, no food preference. So they don't have any defect in their basic metabolic rate, but they can just see they can become markedly fat. Okay, and then their height is normal, by the way, and then obviously their puberty signals are impaired, and with treatment with leptin, again, they can become normal. So there was a lot of enthusiasm that this could be a form of treatment for obesity. So that was considered there was high hope for it, but unfortunately it did not work for people who already had normal leptin levels. So this is a rare mutation that takes place at birth, it becomes hyperphagic in gluttons, okay, type thing. So, and there were some cases reported that a 3-year-old weighed 42 kilograms, okay. Okay, and so this was, the Amgen Pharmaceuticals that tried to market it, but did not pan out to be okay, a good factor. So again, so nature was not going to reveal her secrets that easily. Okay, now, and there are some families that have genetic abnormalities that are found in South America, leptin deficiency, and leptin effect of leptin therapy. You can see how they change dramatically. And similarly in this animal experiment, okay, and some of these the families have been isolated in Pakistan, Turkey, India. So this is rare but interesting abbreviation. Now, some a type of bread, Labradors, are very food motivated, so they have a deficiency, and in a melanocortin neurons inside the brain, which are essential for energy balance, their food intake. So this is aggravated by eating more food and inhibited by energy deficit. So these are the suppressor of appetite releasing so-called melanocortin releasing hormones. So these dogs become, remarkably fat. So they have mutation. Okay, so this is, so 80% of the guide dogs have this type of mutation. So their owners have to be careful in terms of how much. Okay. Okay, so melanocortin mutation is more common in people with, who have a higher metabolic rate. I'm sorry, higher BMI index. Okay, so this is so the same gene has been found in some other animals such as pigs, fish, okay, and even in fruit flies. So this is, so nature has a long way of conserving the abnormality. So you can just see varieties of energy intake that takes place with inactive melanocortin receptors and various mutations from the control hormones to leptin deficiency. Okay, so how intricately all these pathways and neurons are connected. Again, this is a more complex demonstration of the brain-gut homeostasis. Just ignore some of these abbreviations. These are the varieties of neurons that are in our brain, which have a lot to do with, controlling our food intake. Okay, and so this is, again, I think, a bit overdid it. And a lot of these, there are, and we've always, with the rise of the human genome complex, we were always hopeful that we'd be able to find a nice gene for heart attack and one for diabetes, and we'll fix that with genetic surgery, but unfortunately did not pan out. There were as many as 1,000 genes seem to have played. So these are the varieties of names related. So this is truly a polygenic. Now, will we be able to get a handle on this as to polygenic scores? Perhaps in future, but not now. So it's a very complex evolutionary arms race that has taken place. Okay, and now by studying this molecular biology, we are able to get a nice handle on as to how the diabetic drugs will work. Okay, and so I'll just give you some introduction as to how these are the receptors that we talked about in the pancreatic beta cells, and this is where the so-called, or GLP-1 and enzymes, the Ozempic and other things will work at this level. It converts the energy, and these are the glucagon-like peptides. So because the genes make proteins and peptides, and that's how they work. So these are the, and by inhibiting some of these drugs and their metabolism, and we're able to control the food intake and reduce the appetite at the same time. So this is how, after again the standard workhorse of neuron transmission, acetylcholine plays a role, and it works on the reticulums inside the cell. At the same time, the sodium and potassium and calcium play a huge role in working on the energy inside the cell, and in turn releasing insulin. And these are the ones that are written in red are the varieties of diabetic drugs that we'll talk about as we go along in the class. Okay, and again, the importance of simple influx of various inorganic chemicals. It's an essential cell signal for insulin secretion, and that's how the flow is controlled. Okay, and it's again, so this is ion channels. This is going to be my future class, that if I get around to it. Now, the people in the small island of Samoa have about 80% of them have huge obesity. So this is the so-called thrifty gene hypothesis. Okay, the genome-wide study was done. There had abnormalities in a protein that was associated with substantial increase in diabetes and obesity. Okay, so this is for whatever reason. So that may have to do with the so-called founder effect of the gene. Okay, so but so now this when it comes to the South Asia, this has been a interesting theory as to how they can be skinny at the same time they can have fat in all the wrong locations, and you can just see that even with relatively small body mass index, they have increased so-called truncal obesity with very high incidence of cardiometabolic syndrome and diabetes mellitus, okay, compared to the average Western population. And this was a groundbreaking study that was done by a researcher in Pune, which is a city about 100 miles east of Bombay or Mumbai. Okay, along with a study done with his British colleague. They're both more or less had same BMI, but they did what is known as a DEXA scan on themselves, and you can see how the Indian had a lot more fat inside the gut and other essential body organs compared to the Westerners. So this was, a dramatic difference. The two authors shares identical body dual X-ray tomography showed us a first author had substantially more body fat than the second figure author on the left. Okay, so lifestyle changes, so this is, and okay, so, and again, the lifestyle was somewhat different, but still the difference was dramatic, between the two researchers. And again, there were various ethnicities. This was a study done by somebody at UCSF. As you can see, that the Caucasian average North European Caucasian versus Hispanic versus Asian, you can see how the same body mass index, but their visceral adipose tissue was dramatically different, from anywhere from 200 grams Okay, you can just see it was mostly in the hips and buttocks versus around organs. Okay, so that was, huge difference between the three ethnicity. Okay, so this was almost groundbreaking. Now, this was a paper that was published not too far ago, 2023, and this was published in, I think I don't have the original source, but the study was summarized in The Guardian. Okay, and as to why there was more diabetes, because again, during starvation, body tends to conserve fat and nutrition. So, and at the history of famine was looked during the British era due to different taxation policy compared to the Muslim kings and sultans, okay, which they there were a lot more famines that occurred during the 170 years of British Raj, okay, and that may have had an indirect impact on the increase in incidence of diabetes in the current South Asian population. So that's so colonialism had perhaps had some indirect influence on changing the people's epigenetic build-up. So it's an interesting hypothesis, and obviously hard to do research. We can't starve people. So the evolutionary basis of lipid-induced, okay, during starvation, your fat breaks down, and then again you develop insulin resistance. Okay, once you're refeeding, your glucose level goes up, and the availability to it gives a survival advantage. So the evolutionary basis, so and similarly, during the wars that took place during the French-German War in the 19th century, there was less incidence of diabetes mellitus. Okay, and again, there was a discrepancy between the rural and urban area because the rural areas had more food available. Okay. Now there are some other rare diseases that take place called lipedema. So this is, fat buildup in the lower limbs. It can be painful. So again, this your skin looks normal. You feel like a pebble. So this is a rare disease that takes place in some people. Type of skin. So your skin looks normal, but there are like fatty lumps and painful at that site. Almost like a walnut or a cottage cheese type. Okay, so. This is again, so this is a disease called lipedema that takes place in some of the people. And I think I already showed this slide earlier about the so-called healthy fat and obesity-related fat. And the obese fat has a lot more inflammatory tissue reaction that takes place, and the macrophages are infiltrated, the new blood vessels form inside it. Okay, and again, and then and so this is just an introduction to the diets, the American diva Oprah, she used the drugs for weight reduction and promoted that, and that perhaps may have, okay. And again, the way we saw this was somewhere along the line, we got off the chain in 1970. People were not in big diet and big running things, but somewhere along the line, we still, it, so 50 years later, we've changed dramatically in spite of increasing popularity of exercise. Okay, and again, the coronary artery disease had gone up dramatically. It has come down a little bit. Whether that has to do with perhaps more to do with decreased smoking and statin therapy. Okay, and the cigarette consumption has gone down. So it is hard to say which had played bigger role. The so-called French paradox. We have a lot higher intake of more frequent eating and more low-fat processed food. So now there has been a lot of emphasis in recent past on so-called ultra-processed food. And so we talked about the Asian paradox that we've also, science has talked about. And just to repeat, these are the varieties of hormones that we talked about earlier, which are the less, they're more to do with digestion than with metabolism of sugar. This is called gastrin, which comes from the stomach. It has to do with stomach acid and your anemia type of thing, okay, which is the so-called folic acid and vitamin. and the secretin that comes from your duodenum and jejunum that neutralizes all the acid that comes down. Okay, and so this is, again, so this gets into gastroenterology, but we won't dwell too much into it. And finally, cortisol has a lot to do with it. When you're under stress, your body produces more cortisol. And this is the classic example of Cushing syndrome, as you can just see how you can have moon face and a back gibbous, so to speak, stretch mark due to cortisol and vascular fragility. And so this is one example as to how cortisol is related. Okay, and we jumped into the bandwagon of okay. All right, so I think importance of exercise became popular. It was popularized in the ancient era, but the Presidential Commission emphasized it in the 1950s, and the all nations started buying treadmills, and the exercise gurus had their heyday, Jim Fixx, Kenneth Cooper. But again, that really did not have a whole lot of impact on obesity, and people did spend thousands of hours running and this thing. But again, the weight loss, we talked about how the energy expenditure did not match with what we were taking in. Okay, and the food industry, there are varieties of books that have been written about as to how the fast food nation, which was a very popular book about eating the fast food and changing all the biological parameters, that was written by a popular writer, Eric Schlosser, about the dark side of the all-American meal. This was how the food is processed. What we may think about is cheese. It is made from, casein powder that was imported. This is a British book. It was interesting and scary, so to speak, as to how what we think is a natural food and nicely packaged at Publix, but how it is prepared, that's almost gut-wrenching as to how the animals are force-fed with vitamins and chemicals and are added as flavor enhancers. And a recent book that one of the Dutch researchers talked about ultra-processed food, so that has been big into the vogue. Again, so this is just a timeline of how we have gone around for it. Has taken almost 100 years from discovery of glucagon to further establishing the whole role of the liver, alpha cells, and glucagon resistance. Okay, and the role of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So it has been a long biochemical journey as to how, by measuring glucagon, it took another 30, 40 years, and then we finally understood the complex role that glucagon has played. Okay, all right. And again, so how the brain is intricately connected to brain, and gives you when the meal is over, hungry gut, and the emotional hunger. When you're under stress, obviously you eat. And so this is, a varieties of way of, and again, or when you have a hungry brain diet, okay, as to which medications were used for a diet, hungry gut diet, behavioral therapy. So variety now, medicine is becoming somewhat personalized depending upon what is the underlying cause of one's obesity. Okay, and so you can just see that I just thought this was a very fascinating slide, the hungry brain. Okay, knowing when the meal is over. Again, so these were the varieties of medications that were tried. Obviously the surgery had a big role in it. Hungry gut, okay, which is where the GLP-1s drugs that have had some role. Behavioral therapy, hunger feeling diet. Again, this is a drug which is less promoted, but it has a role. This was a bupropion that was used for helping quit cigarette smoking. The habit, the strongest habit to quit. Naltrexone, which was again to reverse the opioid overdose. Okay, so that somebody has combined the drug, and that has been tried in terms of, and have had some reasonable success. Okay. And the role of continuous glucose monitor, which we talked about, that they've changed from varieties of generation ways to scanning to technology, and now, as I mentioned last time, an over-the-counter glucose monitor is now available, which is reasonably priced, but the supplies for monthly supplies can end up becoming more expensive. So I think I will stop here, and we'll talk about diet drugs when when I record the next session. Okay. Thank you, folks. I'll stop share and stop recording.